G'day there, Darcy. So you reached out to me. You wanted to have a discussion about Tartaria. We wanted to have an open-ended conversation about a bit of history, architectural history, looking at some old world buildings and share our ideas and opinions with each other and have a friendly discussion. So over to you. What are your thoughts and opinions on Tartaria? Where do you want to start?
I've got one question for you, and the rest is more just like topics that we can delve into depending on the momentum they gain. We can go into further discussion or just mention them. I'd just really like to give a comprehensive overview of all that I understand and all that's come to my awareness, and then give a little disclaimer about what I stand for and what I represent. I guess I'll kick it off with like the significant question that I've got, which is what evidence are you aware of to support this idea that there was an empire of Tartaria and that they had high technology to create their structures? Like, do you have any evidence, or if you want to ask me what evidence I might have?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a multifaceted question because the idea
Mm,
of Tartaria is suggesting that there's some kind of alternate timeline. Perhaps that's one theory. Why I find this topic so difficult to discuss because there's no concretes. It's not something as simple as globe Earth or flat Earth. It's not something morality, this is right, this is wrong. It's okay, there's been some people who have investigated history and they've found some errors in the mainstream story and they've pointed out some of these flaws, like how there's a recurrence of fires in these old world buildings that seem to be deliberately instigated to destroy them and to refurbish them to cover up evidence, or something is happening there. Too many to be pure chance. It appears orchestrated. The
mm,
narrative around the idea how these buildings were constructed in the past with technology that doesn't seem to suit the demands of such momentous structures, monumental structures. And so
mm,
people who really study this topic, they point out these flaws, but there's no coherent, integrated theory of what exactly the story is. There's just lots of theories thrown out here and there, but there's nothing formal, there's nothing integrated. So that's why I find it very difficult to have a formal position for anything on this. It's like when you ask me what evidence is there of a Tartarian empire, it's like, well, I don't know. Is there any? That is already making many assumptions, many different assumptions. And so, I mean, you can start there, but something easier to start with is when we look at these buildings, do you think the mainstream history of, say, the Vatican, grand buildings like that, the basilicas and the cathedrals, these huge churches, the Colosseum, were they actually built by the people in the past according to mainstream history? And you can start from there. I think jumping into Tartarian Empire, unless you've got something specific you want to say on that on the outset, it's hard to start there.
In response to what you've just said, I feel like there's no concrete theory in place because we're picking up the pieces of something that I don't think there's any real framework or basis for a theory to exist. Like, we are the ones piecing together the foundations, I believe. There's multiple channels I follow who I'll give a quick mention to just so people understand where I've sourced my information from the start. It's been autodidactic. I went and saw a presentation he did in Melbourne called Tartaria, Australia. John Levi, Mind Unveiled, Flat Earth British Sub. That's where I had my first exposure to this whole theory. It's like it were anon. It's
Erwanon.
called right, and
Oh,
it was
yeah.
called What on Earth Happened. That was my first exposure to Tartaria and Flat Earth. My lunch break and Question Everything. That's a Facebook page. So yeah, those are the people that have given me the knowledge I have. But like these are all the people that are sort of like what I understand are building the foundation of this whole theory from the ground up.
Mm-hmm.
No other real point of reference to go from except for like certain documentation, which my lunch break has delved into like old documents. Allegedly, there was this place called the Land of Mu, like this continent that's not on our maps, and the planes fly around. If you look at how planes fly around the planet, apparently they just avoid this patch over the Pacific. And so that's really, as far as evidence goes, or like a foundation for a theory goes, that's really about all I know of.
Well, it sounds like you've looked at more sources than I have. I've studied a few of my lunch breaks videos, maybe 40 or something, but he's got hundreds. I've seen that series presented by Irwin on, and there's some definitely some good points that are being presented, but I think it's difficult to say anything definitively. Yeah, it is something that definitely warrants further investigation. I mean, we're not the people leading the charge on that. We're just having a discussion and sharing our ideas. So people who are really interested, we recommend those channels. But I think you wanted to speak to me to hear my rational perspective, well, on anything really. You want to have the right method coming across things and thinking in the right way, because then you can apply that to every aspect of life and reality, thinking correctly and objectively, and just listening to both sides of the story. And I find it's so easy for people to jump on conspiracy bandwagons without critical thinking. They hear something that is alternative, and then without even thinking, they just jump on board because they say, oh, it's not mainstream, it's opposite the mainstream, so therefore it must be true. And they jump on board without actually thinking it through. And so you don't want to be a victim of that intellectual dependence and addiction to conspiracies. You want to just look into conspiracies based upon the evidence, based upon the facts. And there does seem to be a lot of evidence suggesting that the mainstream history is not exactly the truth. But how far can you really go? Because some of these theories say civilization started 300 years ago or something, and I think that is a hard theory to push. It really is a hard theory to push, that 300 years. What are you saying? What, there was no humanity prior to 300 years ago? Or, well, I don't know, what ideas are you suggesting and supporting? What makes you think there's merit?
Are you asking me now?
Yeah, that was asking you. What makes you think there's merit to the whole idea? Why does it interest you so much? Why does it interest you so much that you wanted to talk to me about it? Why do you think it's so valuable and important?
Naturally, I want to share my ideas and be responsible for like educating or prompting people to think differently, think outside the box. I've sat with this for about 4 years, considering this Tartaria theory and watching other people talk about it. And it's just nice to have a chance to voice my own opinion about where I stand with it. And I think where I stand with it is I stand in a like unbiased position where I'm able to consider the possibility that this empire wasn't built by like godlike beings using some sort of magic or high technology, that it could have just been technology constructed by people with a sophisticated intelligence, but still primitive technological capacity. But also I remain unbiased on the other side of the argument too, where I definitely see how these buildings hold some sort of majesty that we don't construct anything like it today. The buildings we construct today are bleak and uniform and basic and done as cheaply as possible. I feel like the people that constructed these buildings back then could have been both benevolent and malevolent, and they perhaps possessed like a spiritual awareness or understanding of how reality, like the mechanics of reality, and encoded that into the framework of their buildings to leave clues and traces for future generations. And they constructed the buildings with a sense of longevity so that they could be used as a means to decode reality for humanity in the future, to be able to make sense of reality. And the people that built these masterpieces weren't just shallow. It was done with a very specific and important purpose. It wasn't just done as like a means to express themselves creatively. There was actually a mission behind it, perhaps. And I just find it so fascinating because I've spent years of my life since I was 18 and I first became spiritually aware, or aware that there's a metaphysical element to reality, a geometric coding to reality of some description. There's something more the universe is trying to show us, or reality is trying to show us, and these buildings seem to be a representation of that.
Okay. Well, all right.
Yeah,
You've said a lot there. So first,
right.
whenever investigating any aspect, you don't want to go off feelings. You want to go off the method of reason. So it's not a good place to start to say that I feel this is happening. Well, you don't want to be feeling it. You want to be saying this is my viewpoint because of the evidence of this. You want to have reasons behind. Because as soon as you let your emotions get in charge, well, it's not going to be good. It's not going to be good. You always,
Yeah,
always want to be leading with your mind, leading with reason. So that's the first point. But you've also said a lot of other things about spirituality, and seems to be making a lot of assumptions about these people. There was also multiple theories there. You said there was one theory where perhaps they were magical elf beings or magic fairy beings or something like that. They had alien anti-gravity technology or something. So that's some theory out there. Then there's probably the more likely theory. It was just people who had advanced understanding of engineering who actually built it. But then that technology, something happened with that. But then you're also saying there's some kind of spiritual element linked in there, and then making assumptions about like some kind of teleological, purposeful element of the universe with geometry and spirituality. So there's a lot to unpack there. Where to start? I want to start with what you were saying about the geometry. And you're saying you are understanding there's some kind of metaphysical element to reality. Well, when you're using those terms, what are you actually meaning by them? Because metaphysics has a specific definition and is a specific science in philosophy, but how are you using that concept, metaphysics? You said, I've come to realize there is a metaphysical element to reality, and there's this geometry and whatnot, and I want to address this first because this is a deeper fundamental idea you have, which then colors and shapes the other more surface level ideas about, say, Tartaria. So this is a deeper idea. So that's why I want to ask you about that first.
sure. The idea that there's sacred geometry that is like a dimension or a layer of reality that expresses itself into the 3D through the way that plants form or the way that crystals form. For example, you go and contrast a cymatic frequency pattern with a star viewed under a powerful camera lens, or the windows of these grand churches that look like cymatic frequency patterns that look like they have sacred geometry encoded into them. I'm saying that it looks like the builders responsible were trying to teach us something and leave behind a signature of a layer of reality that we need to know about.
I think that is a leap of faith to say that we're trying to teach you something. That's really hard to tell. I mean, the primary purpose of these beautiful buildings seems to be for aesthetics, art. And art really is an end in itself, beauty for the sake of beauty. Why build something beautiful? Because it's beautiful. And we as conceptual, rational beings can appreciate it. Aesthetics, art is a very important part of life. And that idea that there's this other plane of reality, of sacred geometry, so that idea is basically, that's thousands of years old, that idea, and that's coming from Plato, Platonism, from ancient Greece, one of the most famous philosophers. And that's why I find the history of philosophy, now that is interesting compared to the history of architecture, like, because it's ideas that really shape the world. They shape us as individuals, they shape society. Ideas are so important. I mean, sure, Tartaria is interesting, but compared to ideas, yeah, it's nothing. But to continue, Plato was the first one to come up with that idea of the world of forms, this other dimension where forms and universals existed apart from particulars. But then Aristotle came along and he said, who was, I think, a student of Plato, but he surpassed him. Well, there isn't this world of forms. The form and the universals are in the particulars. There are only particular instances. Sacred geometry doesn't exist the way you're thinking of it, right? Sacred geometry and maths, and because people say, oh, reality is made up of numbers and it's geometry, And that comes from Pythagoras, who I think was also a Freemason. You know, you have Pythagoras' theorem and the triangles and stuff, who was also part of ancient Greece, I think contemporary roughly with Plato. But he said the fundamental aspects of reality is numbers and then geometry and all this kind of stuff. But it's like, no. That's a human concept that we apply to measure reality. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, they don't exist in reality, right? They're concepts. If someone tries to say the world is made up of numbers, right, or geometry, shapes, well, there is three what? You can only have 3 instances, 3 bottles of water, 3 apples, 297 grains of sand, or a shape of a pineapple, or a daffodil, a sunflower, right? And then we can say, oh, the shape of this particular concrete instance of an entity, a unit, is like what we can draw on a piece of paper and then compare other things that are like this, or the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden mean and the Adonis index, the pi and whatnot. But they're human inventions, concepts that we can apply and measure reality with. It's a tool. It's not reality itself. Reality is me and you, the shapes of our faces, rocks and trees, but we can measure a tree with a human invention of centimeters, and we can say it is 200 centimeters, so that would be a pretty short tree, 2 meters tall tree, right? But the tree isn't centimeters, it's not numbers, it's not shapes. Shapes are the shapes of things, right? You can't have shape without the shape of something. You can't have numbers without the things that the numbers represent, right? Unless you're just looking at them in their purely symbolic form, because that's what numbers are. They're a symbolic concept we use for unit economization, which is a very, very useful tool, right? Because, for instance, if you have 100 bottles of water, right, on one table, and then you have 101 bottles of water on a table next to it, you can't tell just from looking. If there was 1 bottle and then 2 bottles on a table, well, you can get that, right? You can understand that. 2 and 3, but once it gets higher, those bigger numbers, 100 to 101, the only way you can tell is by using numbers as a method of cognition. You don't have to remember 1, 1, 1, 1. You count with a sequential sequence of symbols, numbers, and each concept represents a particular amount. And then you say 1, 2, 3, up to 100. And then it's just that one word, that one symbol, which represents the concept of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 100. So numbers, and this may seem like it's not related to Tartaria, but it's related to everything, because it's a fundamental belief that can then color everything else. Like if you're thinking the world as numbers and shapes and not having the correct understanding of what numbers and shapes are, and then applying that to objective reality, well, it can affect everything else, all aspects, not just studying Tartaria, but all other aspects of your life. So they're like a conceptual tool that we create, but it's not arbitrary or subjective because humans have created it. We've created it in connection and interrelationship to actual reality, but it's just a measuring tool. Because when you look at a star and you see the frequency of a star, and then you look at the cymatics in a church window, they are very different. Like one is human created, you can clearly tell, and then a star that's obviously something else. It doesn't look like a church window. They just, they're flickering and they're changing. A church window is very orderly, but you can get that kind of cymatic frequency, when you've got those plates, you put the sand on it, you pump a frequency through it. Yeah, things do have an identity. Frequency has an identity and it resonates at a particular frequency, which can cause different shapes. But that's coming back to the law of identity and then the cause and effect of how everything in reality only can act in accordance with its identity. Does that make a little bit of sense?
Yeah, definitely, man. I mean, to me, it sounds like it's almost justifying what I'm trying to say. It's like human beings are trying to influence, or they're being influenced and they're being shaped by something natural, and they're produced that what you're seeing in these church windows could be a product, something they're trying to represent, like art imitating life, kind of. Does that make sense? Is that what
I mean, that essentially is art. I think Ayn Rand describes art as a recreation of your metaphysical value judgments. And I think that is very cool to look at. So what metaphysics actually is, it's the study of the universe as a whole, or you could substitute the word universe for existence or reality, including all dimensions that we know or don't know of. Right? So that's what metaphysics is. And essentially, metaphysics is about existence, consciousness, and identity. That's what metaphysics as a science actually is. For instance, you go to Christianity, their metaphysics is God. Or you might get a skeptics, like the philosophy of skepticism. Their metaphysics is there is no reality. We don't even know if we're actually consciousness, and there is no identity. Right? So they've got, knowledge is not possible. Who knows? Who am I to know? Just go by your whims, right? So that's skepticism. Subjectivism is the primacy of consciousness. Your consciousness creates reality. Just think hard enough and you'll summon a Ferrari, you'll summon the perfect woman. You can change the whole world just by your thoughts because your consciousness creates reality. So, and that's coming from a particular metaphysical view of reality. But the metaphysics I subscribe to is the objective. The metaphysics that we can prove, right? We prove that existence, consciousness, and identity are axioms, which are essentially beyond proof. They are the measurement and standard of proof. You point everything back to these axioms, which can also be called like irreducible primaries, because any argument against existence, consciousness, or identity is self-defeating. Because to say, well, there's no existence, existence can't exist. Okay, well, obviously, like, you just made an utterance. So you exist. If you didn't exist, you couldn't say anything, right? If you're saying, oh, well, we're not actually conscious. Okay, well, either you're conscious and you know you're conscious, or I should ignore you because you are just muttering utterances from a robotic delinquent, just some automaton. And then you have identity. Yeah. Everything has an identity. It is what it is and it's not what it's not. The law of non-contradiction. So essentially, that's metaphysics. So when you use the term metaphysics, what were you meaning?
Just the existence of something beyond the third dimension.
So that's not really normally the study of metaphysics. I mean, everything is the study of metaphysics. Everything is subsumed under metaphysics because metaphysics is related to everything as a whole. I don't know if there's actually a specific science for that, but what does that have to do with Tartaria?
All I'm trying to posit is that, and I'm not a strict proponent for either side of the argument, but essentially I'm trying to suggest the potential, or to me it is likely, I'll say that it is more likely than not, that the people that were responsible for constructing these buildings had not only a high technology, but a high level of spiritual awareness, or awareness of the nature of reality, the mechanics of reality, the fabric of reality, and encoded it into their buildings. That's where I tend to lean toward. I don't strictly adhere to that though.
Okay, let's look at it from a different perspective. Have you ever been to the Burj Khalifa in Dubai?
No.
I think that's a marvelous building. That is a marvelous feat of engineering. That thing is so tall. It's fantastic. Obviously, very different design and aesthetics compared to the Vatican. St. Peter's Basilica, very different. Both fantastically impressive. But let's consider the mindset of the people that would have built the Burj Khalifa. And we have to do a bit of assuming here because we don't know them personally. But I'm sure that we can assume upon pretty solid grounds that what kind of people would they be? But just because they can build a fantastic building doesn't mean they're going to be spiritual. And I need to ask you what you really mean by spiritual, because that's a word like God or sovereignty or something else that people throw around and don't actually have a proper concept behind, but I'll come back to that. Just because people can do one thing really good, why would you then translate and think they're good in other areas you don't have any evidence to suggest that they actually are? Like if someone's a really good basketball player, oh, he must be a very morally good person, or he must be very good at knitting. Just because he's really good at one thing, just because these people can build fantastic buildings, why do you think they've got good philosophies, good psychology, good socioeconomics? They're skilled in other areas. That's just one aspect. one aspect out of human life is huge, is enormous. There's so many things to do, so many things to be good at or not good at.
Right.
So when you say spiritual, what are you meaning spiritual? Why do you think the
I
people
guess
who built those buildings are spiritual and not the people who built the Burj Khalifa or the Rialto Tower in Melbourne?
I would have to say that it's in the design, it's in the color, the creativity, the symmetrical form. Again, any symbology that is encoded into the building, it's all representative of someone with a high intellect or intelligence or awareness of the forces at work within reality. Like if you're spiritual, you're aware that there are facets to reality,
So you take a
that
bridge
there's
maker.
infinite abundance.
Yes, say you have a bridge builder today. Sure, by being able to build a fantastic bridge going over a canyon or to build the Burj Khalifa, of course you have to have an understanding of reality, of engineering and gravity and weight bearing and loads and foundation and okay. So you're saying just because someone is skilled in one particular area, they then become spiritual?
No, it's more a knowledge. It's more like a sacred knowledge. It's
Why
not
is it
just
sacred?
knowledge.
What's sacred about it? Why can you
Well,
sprinkle this word sacred onto something and not some other things? What do you mean when you say sacred? What's
I
sacred?
mean, really, I've given you the best understanding that I have. I'm not like a full proponent for it, but my best understanding is that the people that encoded this cymatic representation into the church windows, they must have been aware that there's some governing force that allows plants to grow in this perfectly symmetrical shape, or this Fibonacci sequence that allows waves to curl and tornadoes to form. Like that's the sort of quote unquote sacred knowledge that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like the laws of physics necessarily, or
But that is the law
weight
of
weight
physics, of waves moving, of how plants are growing. Like that's all the physical laws of nature. If you're just calling the physical laws of nature as sacred, okay, but I don't know why there's a necessity to add that term sacred. I guess in a way you're saying you find it interesting or fascinating how these people who, if the mainstream history was correct, shouldn't have had access to that knowledge because it seems like that's a more modern discovery of the physical laws and geometry or whatnot, other more advanced physical laws. So I think that's really the point you're getting at, and is asking, how did those people back then have access to this knowledge unless there is a part of history we're not seeing? Is that kind of what you're
Okay,
getting at?
yeah.
Is that what you're getting at? Or part of what
That's
you're getting at?
yeah, that's probably a better way to phrase it. I did see this whole Fibonacci sequence as a very deep, more than physical force. It's like it's something that allows physical forces and reality to operate, but it's something more. It's like something that governs the forming of sacred geometry. Like on a psychedelic trip, it's the same force that allows geometry to form, sacred geometry to form when you're hallucinating. Like that's not physical. There's some force there that's beyond the physical to me.
Well, it doesn't matter if it's beyond the physical or not. I mean, we are on the physical. Yeah, people seem to have this aversion to the physical, but it's like the physical, no matter what this world is still part of reality. It's not excluded from reality. Like, even if
Mm.
there's a billion other dimensions in different worlds, like where you could be a DMT alpha in one world, you could be just a pattern in another world, like everything that exists is still part of reality and still has fundamental laws on the way it operates. I mean, the most fundamental is the law of identity, because that's applicable no matter what dimension, and you can know that for a certain fact because the law of identity is everything has a nature and is what it is and is not what it's not in a certain respect in the same time. This bottle is what it is. This is a bottle of water right now. If I then burnt it in a different time, it would be something else. It would change. And that might seem trivial, but once you really grasp that, it gives you a good foundation, a starting point to understand laws. And it's like, well, is that a physical law? It's not physical. Like this is physical, but the law of identity, it's not a physical law. Like, I mean, even gravity is not a physical law. It acts on physical objects. Like Wi-Fi isn't physical, but there's something happening with Wi-Fi and like our voices and sound. There's all these other aspects of reality, all these laws and just nature at work. With this geometry, I don't see the validity of calling it sacred. It gives it some kind of, it's like trying to change the concept into something that it's not. It's like some kind of, you could call it geometry, but sacred it's like trying to apply some kind of mystic feeling to it. Like it's from some other mystic dimension that is totally different to this reality. One of my points is, why is this type of law of geometry sacred, but why isn't gravity considered sacred? Or electromagnetism, or electricity, or fire? Why is it these things, these particular shapes are considered sacred? I mean, it's not a huge issue, but it's like, why the way we use our concepts is very important. The way we use our words, our language, our specificity and accuracy is important. Did you have like a deeper reason? I'm asking you this because I really want to get to the root of what you're attributing, because it almost sounds like you're attributing a whole layer of reality or dimensionality that doesn't exist onto something that's real. Like the thing that's real is, well, there appears to be all these old world buildings that it doesn't make sense how they fit into the mainstream narrative. There's definitely something going on here. But then attributing this whole other layer of the people were spiritual, whatever that exactly means. They were trying to leave us a message. They had some other purpose beyond beauty or aesthetics or whatever their uses for those buildings were. They use sacred geometry. It's like, what are you really trying to say? What do you mean when you're saying sacred and spiritual? I know you said, oh, the color of the buildings and the design, but when we actually look at the designs, I've been to a lot of these buildings and they're just riddled, absolutely riddled with religious iconography. It's just religion everywhere. There's just statues of Jesus sacrificed, and it's just, apart from, you get those windows and it is just the cymatic frequency, the geometric structure in the window, that kind of stuff is beautiful. But there's just religious garbage decorated everywhere. If you're unfocused and you just hazily look around, it's amazing. But when you actually narrow in and you focus, you're like, oh my goodness, there's an atrocity. That dude's getting bitten on the dick by a snake. This painting is a bunch of dudes raping a chick. This one is a guy stabbing a baby. And it's like, to me, that's not spiritual. That's just evil religious bullshit. So what's your point of view on that?
I guess I've always wondered if there were inheritors of these buildings who repossessed them, refurbished them, added their own touch, if you like. The stained glass windows I never saw as part of the original designs, but I think it's easy to like misunderstand what I'm saying and be misrepresented based on an individual interpretation of what I'm saying, because I think it's multifaceted. I feel like a lot of these buildings could have been built by people with a high intelligence but primitive means, primitive technology. But then I think the further back you go into the past, there's the potential that there was high technology that's been lost to the past, and some of these buildings just look too impressive, and like the effort gone to just wouldn't have been worth the time. I feel like there could have been people that came after the buildings were constructed who redecorated them,
Yeah, I find it very hard to separate them though, because a lot of the beauty does come from this religious iconography. Like the stained glass windows are superb. Like if you just ignore all the religious bullshit behind it. When you stained glass windows, oh, I love stained glass windows. They're just magic. It's almost like being on a DMT trip. When you're looking at these windows, like, damn, they're beautiful. The different colors and how they're so big. I think that it's phenomenal technology to be able to do that. And then a lot of these paintings, it's stupid bullshit, but the quality of the paintings, the likeness of them, and how many there are phenomenal as well. The quality is phenomenal. And then the statues of the Pope or the Jesus or whatever idol in there is remarkable, because that links in. It's like the whole mainstream narrative. Were people hundreds of years ago able to carve these beautiful statues of Jesus? How were they able to create the windows of this geometric pattern? How were they able to create this stained glass? How were they able to build these huge pillars and these massively tall constructions with heaps of stone? How are they able to carve the statues like this? It all links in. It all links in. I mean, you could separate it and say, well, they added it afterwards, but still you have that same question. How are they able to do it with such perfection? Or maybe not perfection, but high quality with the tools that they had? That raises the same questions. And so, I mean, you can separate those. You can. I mean, the real question is, how were those buildings built? Because if we just listen to what the mainstream says, and they say those buildings were built by people a couple hundred years ago, or a couple hundred to thousands, because they say humanity is just a consistent timeline from ancient Greece up to now. It was just progressing. But if we're told we had horses and carts, and we didn't have power tools, we didn't have roads and cars and trucks and power tools, then how were those buildings built? If you're going to use hand tools and ropes and pulleys and levers and heaps of manpower, why go to all that effort? It would take too long. There's too much effort. Who's paying for that? Even if you've got all the money in the world, still, it's hard to justify. I think that's getting to like the root of the issue. And then that really raises the question, okay, well, if it doesn't make sense in the mainstream history of humans building it with the technology that has progressively advanced from ancient Greece to where we are today, then how are they actually built? Is there some gap where humans were more advanced and they had better technology? I think the whole idea of needing a mystical race, I mean, maybe, but there'd need to be a hell of a lot more evidence for some mystical, well, when I say mystical, alien race or even giants or something, there'd need to be way more evidence. Like I haven't come across the evidence to suggest that. These buildings, they're grand, but they're within the scope of human potential with the right technology. Human potential and intelligence, because I think it's important to understand human intelligence is very narrow for the most part. Very few people have general intelligence. General intelligence is very rare. It's a very important quality to have. That's why the highest rank in the army is called a general, because he's generally good. He's very specialized in being general, and most people can't do that. Most people are narrowly intelligent, which can be useful for the division of labor in society, having a semi-civilization, but it is absolutely awful for the individual and to have a free society, because when people are only narrowly intelligent, it leaves it totally vulnerable and open to the generally intelligent people who have decided to be evil, because then they can control people so easily, because most people are only narrowly intelligent. They're fantastic at building great buildings, but they're clueless about everything else. Or they're fantastic as a biologist, or they're fantastic as a physicist, but they suck at everything else. And you find this with most people. They're only good at a couple things, and they just lack the interest for other things, or they just, as a biological feature of being a human, are just not good at other things. It's probably more, well, there's big explanations to that, but most people are narrowly intelligent. That's how I describe it. I think by understanding humanity just from that, and there's lots of proof to show, I think that's actually true. It's not just me saying it. I mean, you can investigate and look into yourself. Would you consider yourself to be a generally intelligent or narrowly intelligent? What does it mean to be generally versus narrowly intelligent? But just from understanding that point, if we look, then whoever built those buildings, it doesn't mean they were fantastic in every single way. Sure, maybe they built great buildings, but they were smoking at the pub and getting drunk and cheating on their wives or having wives and all sorts of other kind of heretical immoralities. Like, you can't just say they built a fantastic building, so therefore everything was magical. And some people do that. I've heard that theory before. The theory is, this specific niche theory, there was some other society that was greater than us. They built these amazing buildings, something happened to them, they disappeared or they devolved into our timeline of humanity. And people say, I would have preferred to live back then with those people because they were superior. But it's like, that is a huge leap of faith. Just because they could build cool buildings really doesn't say anything about their philosophy. And philosophy is the most important critical aspect of humanity, because philosophy is the deepest layer. Like, psychology is built upon philosophy. Social, economics, politics, morality, everything else is built upon your philosophy. Well, I mean, morality is included into philosophy, but that's the most important aspect. It's like, say there was a nuclear war tomorrow, and everywhere in the world was practically blown up, except for like Dubai and the Burj Khalifa. And then the little remnants of humanity that started off as cavemen, and they had to go back to hunting and foraging, and then after another 2,000 years have developed, and they're looking back at the Burj Khalifa. They're like, wow, that is a fantastic building. The people of that day and age must have been brilliant. They must have had everything right. If they could build you see what I'm saying? You get that point, yeah?
Okay, yeah, but I think it's more nuanced, James. Like, I truly feel like, well, for example, when I first came across this theory and I was first really getting stuck into it and I was really enthusiastic, you know, I fully subscribe to that. I don't know how I feel so much anymore. I haven't had the time to consider it. But what you're saying, I understand. You can't just use the building as a general measure for who they were. But on the other side of the coin, I think you can learn a lot from who they might have been based on the way they built. And to me, I relate heavily to that idea that, yeah, they were probably more focused on creativity and had free time. They weren't like slaves to the wage. They probably weren't governed by a ruling elite an oppressive ruling elite who built grey, bleak, ugly towers. Like, I feel like they were in tune with sound and frequency and healing, using sound and frequency to heal cancer cells or like any sickness and disease they had. Like, they had these grand organ pipes that were potentially like resonators that could match the frequency of sick cells and destroy sick cells. I do think there's credibility and potential for that idea of like a golden age of civilization that died off. And my lunch break, he touches on underneath like so many of like he's done a lot of research into these crypts and catacombs that are apparently under heaps of different old buildings and churches, and they're all stacked in these geometric forms almost to signify that they were like stacked in this ritualistic fashion, like it was some dark practice, like a potential ritual, like a dark ritual to stack up all these bones. Like, why wouldn't you just throw them under the tunnels? Like, why would you place so much emphasis on stacking these bones in such a
Okay, well, hold up there, because you were talking about like the greatness of the buildings, and then you've gone into like the darkness. So that's kind of
well,
two topics.
I'm trying to say that maybe this golden age of civilization was taken over. Like, there's this warring faction, these two warring factions potentially. Because like I look into ancient scripture. I spent a lot of years looking into ancient scripture, and well, the people who did research it, for example, these different alien factions that were at war, and maybe it's a back and forth, and like there was a golden age, there was a righteous, like a period where this righteous being was ruling over humanity, or humanity was more tapped into love and light, and then
Hold on, I just
some evil.
have to stop that. A righteous being ruling. It's like,
Well,
say, a beautiful, kind rapist.
no,
Like,
like guiding. guiding or like
Well,
I
that's
don't know,
very different
just
to
like
ruling.
I don't know. I need to pick my words a bit better, but like I just mean there was a righteous force. There was some sort of like
Hmm.
potential alien, like extraterrestrial, or even just humankind doing it of their own accord, being like
I
um
mean, they're nice ideas, but what are the reasons to back that up? I mean, like you said a couple good points. Like you can tell something about someone by what they build, but still you can't tell that much. It's like there's lots of beautiful buildings that are modern today. You go inside and they've got great interior designings. The outside isn't as aesthetically pleasing as those old world buildings, but you can get some beautifully designed cafes and all the inside is just superb. But the people who do that, maybe jabbers. They probably vote in elections. They probably have a Tesla. It's not to rule out and say in totality that the people who built those buildings were bad people. I'm saying you can't know. You can't know. You can have some ideas perhaps, but it's not really evidence for anything. You can say, well, there were beautiful buildings. And then
mm,
perhaps, yes, some other evil force like the Christians came and desecrated those buildings and put all their religious iconography everywhere. Perhaps they seem so woven together that it happened at the same time, but that is hard to tell for sure. You can't fully tell their philosophy. And if they
mm.
were so great, it's like, well, what happened? What happened? So it can't have been that good. Maybe it
Well, I
was. Maybe it was slightly better than what we have today. But again, it's just hasty generalizations from not enough evidence. There needs to be a lot more research to really try and figure it out.
I agree. I think you're taking the more sensible approach, and I was quite young and naive at the time, and was more subject to interpretation or like influence and being stewarded by someone else's ideology. I suggest there was like a cataclysm that's caused a quote unquote reset, and there's traces and evidence of that. There's
Mm.
melted structures. There's structures that don't, they look like natural formations that if you investigate closely through Google Images or Google Earth, you can zoom in and see that there's brickwork that's been looks like it's been melted.
Yeah, they're interesting. I've been to some of those locations in Turkey, like Göreme. They're quite curious structures. They almost look like ant or termite hills, some of them.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, John Levi did good work, a lot of good work around that. He did one video on the Shiprock in Utah. It's like this giant fence line, like a big wall, and then there's a middle point where it intersects, I think, three ways in the middle, and it looks like an old castle, perhaps, or something. Also, the mud flood theory. There's certain parts of that theory that are obsolete to me now. Like I've been through Melbourne and all these cities through Australia, and you can see buildings that are like placed up against a hillside, and
Yep.
it looks like, and there is a basement going underneath, but it looks like the windows are half underneath the street level, and
Yep.
it doesn't make sense why you'd have a window halfway out of the street. But I
Okay.
mean, part of that, I feel like, yeah, they just built some of the buildings like that, but then you see photos of some buildings that are like 3, 4, 5, 10 levels underneath the ground that have been excavated, and I mean, to me, I don't think it's preposterous to believe that a giant wave or like there was a giant flood that carried a lot of sediment and silt and buried a big portion of architecture. I don't think that's crazy at all to think that that could have happened. I think there could have either been like an extraterrestrial force or like some otherworldly non-human force that like destroyed the old world, destroyed the old civilization, or a cataclysm that did it.
Let's touch on that because, yeah, I've seen some of that evidence, yeah, for the mud floods, and there does seem to be a decent amount of evidence to say, yeah, something happened. Yeah, where there was a flood, tsunami, liquefaction, earthquakes, something seems to, I mean, from the limited evidence I've come across, and there seems to be in many different countries a similar theme. I mean, natural disasters do happen, okay? with the melted buildings, it's like, well, was that a natural disaster? Was that humans warring against each other in some kind of, bomb or technology? Yeah, what was it? Aliens? Well, to jump to the alien hypothesis, it's like, well, what evidence is there to suggest that it was aliens doing that?
No direct evidence as far as I've seen, but I definitely reserve room for the potential and likelihood that there's otherworldly or interdimensional or extraterrestrial or non-human
Aliens.
beings that,
Yeah.
yeah,
But
that
aliens.
have some hand in the direction of humanity, and that they influence us and play some part in our existence. Nothing's off the table for me.
That is a hard one because you just have to rely upon testimonials for aliens, but it's just that there's so many testimonials. It's hard to ignore that. You can't just outright ignore that. There's just too many testimonials of people interacting with grey aliens, with reptilians, manted beings. I mean, the greys seem to be the most common from what I've studied and come across. But really, this is all interesting. And it's like, well, what's the point of discussing all this? And my point is, why I discuss everything, is to create a utopia. I want to create the best possible world that humans can create. That's why I do everything I do, because I want to be the happiest I possibly can. And the happiest I possibly can is in a world where people are as intelligent as possible, are as rational as possible, and are as free as possible. Because that means they're going to create a better world that I want to live in. It creates a peace and order. So that's why I discuss everything I talk about. But people are always so quick to blame everything but the real problem, right? Oh, it's the natural cataclysms. That's the big thing we have to watch out for. They're the cause of all the evil in the world. Or it's the cabal and the Bill Gates and the Donald Trumps. They're the real problem. Oh, it's the aliens, the grey aliens, the reptilians. They're the real problem. It's like, no. The real problem is your fellow man and his indifference to reality. That is the problem. Obviously not you, but other people. They need to look within. You're actually very good at it, wanting to take that unbiased, objective, rational point of view and changing your mind, but that's a very rare trait. That should be just a general quality of humanity, but it's not, and that's a problem. Because when you have that quality, as I do as well, wanting to just be objective and go with the facts, if you come across new information that contradicts your current point of view, you don't get married to a belief. That's weak, that's cowardly. No, you be proud, you be strong. You go, okay, I don't care if I was wrong. Show me the evidence. I'm going with the facts. Present me the reasons, the arguments, logically, and I go in that direction. And most people don't want to do that. Their self-esteem they've warped their own self-esteem, or they've allowed the influence of everyone else around them to warp their self-esteem. So they built everything from shaky foundations, because I think that is one of the root fundamentals. When you have a healthy self-esteem, you don't put up with bullshit. You don't believe the lies. You don't accept all this nonsense that goes into your head to worship aliens or gods or government and other people. You say, I have self-respect. No way am I doing something that's stupid. What? You're telling me I should be humble? I should be a servant? I should serve? No thanks. I'm not doing that. Trust the experts, trust the authorities. Don't think for yourself. Don't think about morality. Don't think about philosophy. No thanks. No, because I've got self-esteem, right? And you obviously do as well. Self-respect, just inherently knowing, well, I'm worth something because I am me. I can feel pleasure and pain. I'm conscious. I'm not anyone else. I am me as an individual, uniquely myself. So of course I care about myself. Of course I take my life seriously. That's the problem with so many people. You see on the dating apps, the girl's always right. I'm looking for a guy who doesn't take life too seriously. It's like, oh my goodness, that's the world we're living in today? People don't even understand how horrific a statement like that is. So you want a guy who thinks he's a joke, who takes life as a joke. It's like, well, life is the measurement against which everything else is measured against, which is serious. What's more serious than life? Nothing is more serious than life. A man who doesn't take his life seriously doesn't take himself seriously, because he's a nobody. He's decided to be a nobody and no one. And it's these kinds of ideas, this kind of philosophical viewpoint on the world of having no self-esteem, just being Play-Doh for someone else to mold, that's the real evil in the world. That's what's controlling the world. If people were like you and me and actually thought and wanted to be sovereign and rational and intelligent, the aliens couldn't do shit if there are aliens who are controlling it. The cabal, the Bill Gates, the Donald Trump, the Elon Musk, the Pope, all those other douchebags, right? They can't do anything. They're powerless. But it's because people, the masses, they're the problem. They're the actual problem. And they commit evil every single day and they don't even realize. And that's the evil because they evade the responsibility of being a conscious, living and intelligent, rational being. They evade that fact with all the power they have. They evade the responsibility of thinking. That's the real issue. Yeah, I know I covered a lot of topics there, but I was trying to integrate it into that's the real problem. That's the real problem.
Yeah. No, it's relevant, man. I think we could all find a more grounded, consensual point or maybe mutual point of view on the matter, which I would argue, you know, if I was to try and make an objective analysis or conclusion would be that we don't know and we won't know until we come together. And that's what I listen to a lot of Max Eigen's work, and that's what he says is like we can bicker back and forth about this and that, the shape of the planet, who controls the planet, but we won't truly know until we decide to unify as a people.
People like to say stuff like that, and it's good. They need to say stuff like that. And David Icke, who's very famous as well, but they just don't know the philosophy. They don't know the social economics. They've studied all the conspiracies and they have good intentions and they say these words, but where's the practicality of that? People say, yes, okay, we need to come together. How? What does that even mean? Without a philosophical foundation of understanding, well, metaphysics, epistemology, and morality, how are people meant to construct a orderly, proper social economics? I don't even say politics, because normally in philosophy, that fourth rung of philosophy is called politics. But my point of view, my understanding, well, it's not my understanding, it's just the fact is, you can't have a politics. We don't need a politics. What we need is a proper social economic system, which is capitalism, which is voluntary trade. And there's a whole lot of other points behind what capitalism is. We need morality. We need to understand actually what rights are. We need to have a proper epistemology of reason. Epistemology, fancy word, it's just the study of how do we know what we actually know. Is it by faith, subjectivism, mystic authorities, revelations from God? Or is it via reason, via logic, rationality? That's the way we know the world. That's the way we know ourselves. And then metaphysics, coming back to the primacy of existence, consciousness, and then identity, and integrating those. And that's a very quick summary, but it's important for people to know this stuff. And I think the unfortunate truth is most people don't want to know this stuff, no matter how sexy you wrap it, no matter how easy you break it down and how much you simplify it. People just don't care. They don't want to rule themselves. They want to be ruled. And that's the awful predicament we're stuck in. How do you fix a world that doesn't want to be fixed? That's hard. That's some of the hard questions.
If I was to try and answer that, what came to mind instantly was helping people to identify the nature of evil or the nature of that which is ruling them in an evil manner. Generally helping people to see the nature of darkness is a good way to get people to take accountability for themselves and make a push toward creating better energy and positive, I don't know, just positivity in their own life, because ultimately it's just negativity in a lot of senses. If you're being ruled, if you're not thinking for yourself, you end up going through a lot of unnecessary hurt and hardship.
I definitely agree. What you said is definitely true, that people need to learn how to identify evil. That is extremely important. Most people don't even believe in the existence of evil. Like, they don't understand evil properly. Like, even Ayn Rand, as a philosopher, called out evil massively, but still, some of the most brilliant minds in the world just can't understand actual evil and realize, hold on, We're at war. We've been at war for as far as history can tell. There's a group of evil, satanic psychopaths who are constantly dominating the world. And the sad thing is, from their point of view, they probably don't even see it as evil, because the people they dominate and rule beg to be ruled and dominated. They beg to be tortured and enslaved. And that's the sad thing. So then the cabal goes, we're not evil. We're just giving these foolish idiots, these narrowly intelligent fools, what they want. And so, that is a huge problem I'm facing at the moment, because coming up with solutions to all of society's problems, simple. That stuff is easy. But convincing people that they should listen and change, that is next to impossible. That's going to take the next 5-10 years of my life to study to see if I can figure out if that's actually possible. 100% agree. Yeah, learning the nature of evil. That's why I recently just made a 4-part series about the nature of evil. Learning how to identify evil. What does that actually mean? And ultimately, the real evil is the masses. They're the real evil ones. And they don't even realize it. And that's the problem. I've got 11 axis point of evil, the desire to cause harm, actual harm, understanding of morality, etc. There's all these different points. Essentially, evasion and dishonesty are the root cause of all evil. Evasion and dishonesty. And that's what most people are. Most people are dishonest and they evade reality because they say, I don't want to believe in reality. I want to believe in the fairy tale that I'm being fed by my parent, teacher, professor, politician. They want to eat that up. I want to believe that Trump is here to save everything, because then I don't need to think. I don't need to exercise my inbuilt rationality and act human qua human. They act human qua animal, as a non-conceptual, perceptual. And they stick purely to the perceptual level of existence. And you can hardly even call that conscious. And it's disgusting, it's revolting, because humanity's nature is as intelligent, rational beings. But they don't live up to their potential. And so no wonder people are so depressed. They feel guilty. They say they're happy, but they need to get drunk all the time, or they smoke cigarettes, or they take drugs. Oh, but I'm happy, I love life. No, you don't. People don't love life. People who love life don't avoid it like the plague. You hear this all the time, and you hear that, but there's some people who are really actually happy. But anytime you bring up a conspiracy, no, I don't want to hear that. No, that will burst my happy bubble. So you're telling me you're happy, but you are terrified out of your mind to actually live in the real world and to hear the facts and integrate them into your whole set of knowledge that you possess. That's not happiness. That's evasion to the extreme. That's living under your blanket like a little child, like a cowardly, frightened little kid. Living under I'm happy as long as I'm under the blanket. But as soon as I take the blanket off and I look into the real world, no, I can't deal with it. Because people lack courage as well, because they lack self-esteem. There's a lot of psychology philosophy here linking in with Tartaria, but it's all linked. Right. Knowledge is all connected. What happened to the Tartarians? Well, they obviously, as a collective or group of humans, right, they didn't have the right philosophies. They didn't have the right psychology. They didn't have the right socio-economic systems. Because if they did, they would be here today. So that's why I think, sure, it's interesting and it is important to study these topics, but there are also priorities. You can't I don't think you should prioritize studying the history of architecture and these old world buildings over philosophy and psychology and social economics. In conjunction with those, yeah, absolutely. But there is a list of priorities. Some things are objectively more important to study and learn and to grow and develop yourself in than others. Before we wrap up, Darcy, I'd like to just get your overall summary of your perspective on Tartaria.
I see the potential for it to be this civilization created by people with an advanced knowledge and advanced technological capacity, but I also relate to the sentiment. It was just like the product of a people who didn't really have any other focus. They were more reliant on their own intelligence. They weren't so focused in on electronics and living in cyberspace like the that was largely their world and their creative outlet for hundreds of years. And it makes sense why they were able to refine their craft to such a point, even if they were just using primitive technology. I definitely respect the truth movement and the people investigating the potential of something else being the case, because there are evil forces that rule this planet, and they have created such a sense of distrust amongst each other, within ourselves, toward them. So it's no wonder that we're looking for answers. And history has largely been fabricated in a lot of areas, I believe. Yeah, it just makes sense that people would be pursuing answers for themselves.
Definitely a story that needs to be uncovered. Yeah, the mainstream story, there seems to be flaws in it. What the end result is, what the conclusion, the final hypothesis will be, I don't know at this point. But it is fascinating, it is interesting, it is something that demands further attention and further research as rationally as possible, only based upon the evidence, and trying not to jump to conclusions that are unvalidated or hard to verify. For instance, with not in cyberspace and not using the internet and electronics, maybe those people did have electronics and that's how they were able to build those buildings. And maybe they just were so far into the electronics that built AI androids who built those buildings for them. Or they just 3D printed everything. No, I'm not saying that's the truth, but potentially, like, you don't know. It's very hard to say. You can't just it's hard to look at the building and say, those people didn't have electronics, or they smiled on Wednesdays and shook each other's hands on Thursdays. It's like, well, we can't tell that. And I mean, that's why people study it. That's why we study it. We need to lay out the evidence in front of us and look at the reasons for everything and try and figure out what happened, because it's important. It's important because it puts together a story. So you can study the history of money. That's an interesting one. The history of philosophy, the history of buildings and architecture. They all fit in together. There's a bigger story that is waiting to be unraveled. It's still a mystery at this point, but if it happened, there has to be enough evidence and clues to be able to piece it together. Though in totality, is that possible? No, I don't know for sure. I think at the end of the day, it's important to focus on the priorities, which is trying to make this world as better a place as possible. And the way we do that is by learning what's really important: philosophy, our own psychology, social economics, morality, using reason as a method of understanding reality, getting the right metaphysics, capitalism, learning what consent is and voluntary interaction. Because the reason we're in such a predicament is because people don't understand those simple things, and then they give all their power away and support an evil regime which can, at will, cover up all the history. Because if there wasn't the masses who were so indifferent and uncaring and apathetic and intellectually lazy, who supported evil rulers, then there wouldn't be all this suppression of history, because no one would be able to suppress history. If we all decided to be like me, and you're on this path too, to be rational, to be as intelligent as possible, to be as knowledgeable and objective as possible, to be sovereign, to be strong, to be courageous, to be intellectually independent, all these virtues and values leading to a happy life, if everyone decided to do that, the evil system would fall overnight. It couldn't sustain itself. It'd be like a mosquito landing on your hand. End of story. Game over. It's done. Evil can only prosper in this world because people let it. They allow it. They demand it. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. That's the real thing that needs to be fixed. Because even if everyone stopped studying Tartaria, I mean, really, the quickest way to figure out what would happen is to fix all those other problems, people's philosophy, really, and then get rid of all these evil governments and bring in systems of capitalism, of voluntary trade, peaceful interaction. And then we'd be able to go into the Vatican and you could get all these secret scrolls and texts and be able to you'd get all these evil people who are the politicians and the bankers, you'd lock them up, put them in their rehab centers away from the rest of society, and they've got nothing else to do but talk, so you could probably interrogate them without needing to torture them, which is a win-win for everyone, and find out what's actually happened. Because I mean, really, when you think about it, that would be the best way to find out, is ask the people who know, because there will be people who know what's actually happened. So that would be the best way. I mean, if you want to talk about thinking outside the box, that's thinking outside the box.
I always used to say storm the Vatican archives, not Area 51.
I wonder if anything of importance is actually there, because it's open to the public. You can go through most of the Vatican. I mean, I went there. It was quite phenomenal, actually. Yeah. Wow. I mean, the heart of evil. The locus of control of the world. Fascinating. But okay, any other final words, Darcy? Any other closing points?
That's all from my end, man. Thanks for having me on.
Beautiful. Pleasure as always. Yeah, look forward to having another discussion at our leisure. Yeah.
Sounds good, man. You take it easy, yeah.
All right, we'll finish this up. Okay. Bye-bye.